Hi there, I'm Jack.
And I'm Matt.
And this is the MindKeepers podcast.
We are an educational platform with the mission of guiding people to take the first step to addressing their mental health. I move from desensitization and...
You can't say it.
It's actually
hello.
The voice.
Huh?
It's the voice because the voice sounds so good.
Oh, right, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Hello.
It's sort of in the voice.
Shut up.
Go on, go.
Oh, I've just popped out the participants bar. Hello and welcome to another episode of the MindKeepers podcast. Today, we are on season 1, of course, of our Anxiety Explained series, and we're on episode. Hang on, got to do a bit of counting now. 1, 2, 3, 4. We're on episode 6, Matt. Unbelievable.
Episode 6. Brilliant.
I know. How time flies when you're having fun. Today, we're going to be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is an interesting topic, of course, to be talking about. But first of all, Matt, before we get down to the nitty-gritty, what is your number?
What is my number? So just to give everyone a bit of context, anyone listening, the numbers game that me and Jack play is every time we catch up, we give ourselves a number from 1 to 10 based on how we're feeling with our mental health. So 1 is, I'm absolutely dreadful, and 10 is I'm on top of the world. And it just gives me and Jack a chance to check in on each other and see where we are, and basically, check that the other person is okay. So it's always a nice game to play, isn't it, Jack? So the numbers game for me is, I'd probably say I'm probably about a 6.
Okay.
Yeah, little bit lower today. I always like to go for an even 7, but it's just because busy week. Lots going on. The weather's been a bit dull. I had a bit of trouble sleeping the other night as well, which was quite interesting. So yeah, just a little bit like, I'm feeling the pressures of the world at the moment.
Yeah.
And not extremely, but definitely enough to give myself the 6, as opposed to up there in the 7, 8s and 9s. What about you?
Well, 6 isn't a bad score. I find as well, Matt, changing the weather sometimes it makes me swing kind of either way. And we've had some not so nice weather after a glorious sunshine, didn't we? But I would say similarly, actually, I'm going to match you on a 6. Same kind of reason. I had my COVID jab last week, and I think it's just knocked me for 6. Knocked me back slightly. I can see it. Matt is laughing, just so everyone on the podcast is listening. I can see him, and he did giggle at my joke there.
It was a funny joke. Yeah. I relate to that joke. It was a very good one. Well done.
But yeah, I'd say a 6. Likewise, work a little bit heavy. Also, being stuck in a bit of a monotonous routine at the minute, it just kind of gets you down in the dumps. And the weather, when I'm quite a cold morsel, so whenever there's a drop in the weather, I feel it. So yeah, I'd say I'm a 6 as well. So we're on the same page today, Matt. We're on the same page.
That's good. That's good.
Good to hear you're doing well. So yeah, of course, now we've got the important part of the way with the numbers. We're going to crack on with post-traumatic stress disorder. So what are we going to cover in today's podcast? Well, first of all, definition of post-traumatic stress disorder. Then we're going to follow that with discussing the causes of PTSD, some of the symptoms as well. And we're going to round everything off with some of the treatments that are available for PTSD as well. So without further ado, Matt, I'll kick things off with a description of what PTSD is and what it actually stands for. What is post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, is an anxiety disorder caused by very stressful, frightening, or distressing events. Post-traumatic distress disorder, Matt, is one that I've actually heard a lot of before, and and I don't mean to, this is me looking at it quite naively, I suppose, but it's one that I always used to associate with something like army veterans
Hmm.
or service personnel would be sufferers from post-traumatic stress disorder. It's something I suppose that I saw from watching TV dramas or something like that. I remember there was one in Casualty once when an army veteran was suffering from PTSD. And I suppose that gives us a bit of an inkling into what post-traumatic stress disorder actually is, because it's, of course, military personnel. They've come back from very distressing times, frightening times, and are suffering with residual anxiety from that.
And I think there's probably a lot. I probably don't think you're alone with that idea of who has post-traumatic stress disorder. I think I've seen it before as well. I'd probably say that's what I mostly associate it with, which is the condition that someone from a military perspective has potentially had it. But there are lots of different scenarios where it could apply. So it's interesting that you think that, because that resonated with me as well.
Yeah.
I suppose when we look at the causes then of post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is actually, and I suppose it links to what you're saying, which is that even though you might link that to someone from actually, any situation that a person finds traumatic can actually cause PTSD. So something that is what we'd call atraumatic for one person can actually be traumatic for another person. So it's not fully understood why some people develop the condition and why some others don't. But yeah, it's kind of like it can be any situation that a person finds traumatic that could then cause that PTSD.
Yeah, like you say, Matt, one situation affects probably one person different to the next, as we found when we've spoken about anxiety throughout this series, is that different people react in different ways, and different people deal with anxiety as well in different ways, and it manifests in different ways as well. And that's exactly the same for post-traumatic stress disorder. But we do have a few common causes of PTSD. If we rattle through a few of them, first of all, potentially a life-threatening event might cause PTSD to develop. So like we just said, that experience of potentially violence, including, military combat, a terrorist attack, or a violent assault, but it can also expand into other life-threatening events as well. So being involved in a car crash, maybe you have flashbacks to that event, being raped or sexually assaulted as well, being abused, harassed, or bullied, potentially even including racism, sexism, and other types of targeted bullying, being kidnapped or held hostage, maybe a traumatic childbirth as a mother or partner witnessing a traumatic birth, and also losing someone close to you in particularly upsetting circumstances as well.
There's some quite horrific events there that could potentially cause PTSD. So it's quite a severe thing to experience and to go through off the back of what could be a very horrible event there, isn't it? Which is and when you look at some of the reasons why someone might have post-traumatic stress disorder, it can be, it's not a nice thing. I can imagine it's not a nice thing to experience.
Yeah, and I think with the list of those things as well, a lot of them can be quite unexpected as well, and could just happen kind of out of the blue. And we can't always predict what's going to happen in our lives, especially with these unfortunate events. So yeah, they're bound to have a long-lasting effect on us later down the line in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder.
So I suppose in other areas then, in terms of scenarios that might make you more susceptible to post-traumatic stress disorder, are there any there that we have there, Jack? I think there are a few, aren't there, that might potentially make you more susceptible. Is there something that does make you more susceptible or not?
Yeah, there are. So if you have had depression or anxiety in the past, or potentially even if your family and friends do not give you adequate support following a traumatic event, then you are more prone to developing PTSD. Having a support network around you after a particular event, confiding in people, whether that be friends or family, or even getting professional help as well, is really important to try to prevent PTSD from from developing, and that anxiety to developing and festering as well. So yeah, you are more susceptible if you've had depression or anxiety in the past, or if you don't have that adequate support following the event. And also repeated trauma can also compound the problem as well. So if you are facing repeated traumas or are dealing with extra stress from, I suppose, compounding problems such as potentially bereavement or even money worries, which are just getting more and more out of control, potentially like relating back to what we said, Matt, about bullying, or even homelessness as well, then because there's no mitigation or there's no solving of these traumas and they are just getting worse and worse, you are more likely to experience that PTSD. I think, Matt, it's like we've spoken about in a previous podcast about being able to know when perhaps you're suffering with a form of anxiety and taking that time to reset, recharge, and trying to deal with it. With PTSD, it's less, I suppose, to do with taking time out and recharging. Say, for example, if you're suffering with burnout or just stress in general, but because there is a source causing that post-traumatic stress disorder, which is compounding, it can be particularly difficult to actually nip it in the bud and stop it from having that effect. But trying to understand what that trauma is and trying to get to the bottom of it and eradicate it could go a long way to try to eradicate the PTSD that you may be experiencing. And finally, as well, there are genetic factors which are believed to be involved in post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So if a parent has a mental health issue, then it may increase your chances of developing the condition. Again, Matt, like we've spoken about in, I think it was the generalized anxiety disorder podcast, we know that genetic factors and biological factors can make us more susceptible to developing anxiety as well. So it's important to know that that is a potential factor that may cause PTSD as well.
So I suppose if we then now, that's a little bit about, post-traumatic stress disorder, what it is, and then I suppose some of the causes there. I suppose that if we now look into more around the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you think about it, then there are actually many ways, like with a lot of mental health conditions like that we talk about on here, that there are many ways in which an individual can experience PTSD. Symptoms, though, are generally grounded into what they use 4 types. So you've got intrusive memories, avoidance, negative changes in thinking and mood, and then changes in physical and emotional reactions. So actually, again, like we've talked about previously on previous podcasts around, you can face some, none, or all of these. So it just depends entirely on the individual. But I think it's useful just to go through a few of them, just to make people aware of some of the symptoms that you can get through post-traumatic stress disorder. So intrusive memories, these include things like flashbacks, nightmares, images. The memories are usually distinct because they lack awareness that they're actually from the past, and they believe that they experience a threat in the present. So it might be, for example, unwanted distressing memories of a traumatic event, or reliving the traumatic event as if it were happening again. So having flashbacks, upsetting dreams, nightmares, and traumatic events, and also, severe emotional distress and physical reactions to something that might remind you of that traumatic event. So, it's intrusive memories are, it's things like flashbacks, nightmares, images, things that, bring people back into that trauma. So that's intrusive memories. You've also got avoidance. So avoidance then is where a person changes their behavior to avoid thinking about, feeling, or doing difficult things. So an example of this symptom is you might try to avoid thinking or talking about the traumatic event because you can avoid that then. You could also potentially avoid places, activities, or even people that remind you of a traumatic event. You've also then got your negative changes in thinking and mood. So this is things like negative thoughts about yourself. You've got hopelessness, memory problems, including not remembering important aspects of the traumatic event, difficulty maintaining close relationships, feeling detached from family and friends, and feeling generally emotionally numb. And then finally, you've got then changes in the physical and in your physical and emotional reactions. So this could be things like being easily startled or frightened, always being on guard for danger, using self-destructive behavior, such as drinking too much or too fast. You've got things like irritability, angry outbursts of aggression, and also just, overwhelming sense of guilt and shame. So, that when you think about them four sort of, I suppose, categories that they put them into, there's a lot of horrible, really nasty symptoms there, which is
Really
why I was
quite
always
severe.
yeah, I think it's always great when we talk about the symptoms on there, because I think it really brings to life how horrible some of this stuff is to experience.
Yeah.
And I think that, this is one really that hits it home with me when you look at it.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And I think one of the things that hits home with me as well is about, particularly, you'd be able to notice these symptoms in, say, a friend or a family member, I think. Interestingly, like those ones about, such as drinking too much in particular, or trying to mask what they're truly feeling, and even feeling potentially detached, or whether that's from friends or family. Maybe they're not as buoyant as they used to be. Maybe there's kind of like a personality change there. And I feel like that's why it's really important for people who aren't maybe suffering from PTSD to still be aware of these changes that can go on for an individual who might be suffering, so that you can acknowledge it and maybe direct that person who might be suffering in the right direction to addressing that PTSD, rather than letting it fester and compound, which we've seen as a major cause for it kind of proliferating. So yeah, really important to understand them symptoms, Matt, because they are quite severe and quite broad as well. But it's also important to understand when these symptoms would occur as well. So in relation to the traumatic event, the symptoms may occur weeks after it. They might not appear immediately after, and it may even take them years after the event to occur as well. They can cause problematic changes to your social and work life, as well as relationships with loved ones. So that point I've just touched on there, it may be very noticeable to maybe work colleagues, friends in your social circle, or the people nearest and dearest to you as well. So not only that, but there are some physical changes in the body. Studies have shown that people with PTSD have abnormal levels of stress hormones like adrenaline or cortisol as well, which are usually only triggered when you are in danger. I've actually read up quite a lot on cortisol and how it really does wreak havoc on your hormones. So I'm not surprised that some quite severe kind of physical symptoms come along with that. An example, things like your metabolism, your digestion can really be messed up when cortisol levels are high. And this is actually referred to as a fight or flight reaction, which helps to dull the senses and numb the pain that you may be going to. This high amount of fight or flight hormone is thought to explain the numbed emotion and hyperarousal experienced by someone with PTSD. So yeah, I find that staggering, that you may not actually get them symptoms and potentially years after, but like we can see here, they are severe and they can wreak havoc on your body as well. So it's important to signpost that, whether you're suffering potentially from it, or if you think somebody might be suffering and you can see that these symptoms are manifesting, then it's important to have an intervention.
When you look at the symptoms there and you look at them, that they're quite visible symptoms as well, aren't they? You think about it like that, you can, it's almost like, we talk about how we associated things like PTSD with, the military and things like that, and people in the armed forces potentially feeling it. And it is so interesting because it's so visible. And I think sometimes you almost feel a bit, I think it does raise, that we talk a lot about stigma around mental health. And it is so funny because I think these are such visible symptoms and so physical, and actually, like, a lot of people might feel that they're very abnormal. So you might have your experiences with people who may have suffered from this, may be really quite because you kind of fear what it is, don't you? You fear the unknown. And I always feel like it's a really interesting one from a stigma perspective, that when you think about how people experience this, and the fact that people don't necessarily, when you look at the symptoms and break them down, you realize just basically what it's like to go through and how terrible that must feel. And then actually on top of that, you've got this stigma where nobody really wants to talk to the guy with the PTSD. Do you know what I mean? Because they're scared that they're going to have an outburst, and it must be quite horrible and quite isolating to feel like that.
Definitely.
Or to have happened on top of going through all of the symptoms. That's quite.
Yeah, definitely. I'd agree, and I think it's quite similar actually to when we've discussed, I think, phobias as well, or what I've seen about phobias, and that, we kind of bat the term around potentially quite trivially sometimes in society without understanding the effect that it might have on someone who's suffering with a phobia. And I think it's similar with potentially PTSD as well. I've learned a lot through the research of PTSD. I'm particularly staggered about that. I know I've just touched on about it, but the fact that it can actually, appear and the symptoms can actually manifest a couple of years after. I always associated PTSD with being, as soon as the person's experienced that trauma. So I find that really staggering. But yeah, I completely agree. It is about breaking that stigma and just being aware of what we're talking about when we're talking about PTSD.
So I suppose one of the things as well that we talk quite a lot about, Jack, is around the treatments. We talk about a lot about getting help, don't we? And I think that's one of the things that we've got here, which is there are a number of treatments that I think we can discuss that are available for post-traumatic stress disorder, aren't there?
I will kick off with them. Like all anxiety disorders, there are treatment options that could potentially ease the post-traumatic stress disorder or even cure the symptoms that you may be experiencing. First and foremost, you have trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which is a common theme that we're finding as a treatment option for anxiety. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy is a form of CBT specifically adapted for post-traumatic stress disorder. And the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence recommends that you're offered potentially 8 to 12 regular sessions of around 60 to 90 minutes of CBT, seeing the same therapist at least once a week. So I can definitely see how CBT, when we spoke about how PTSD is in the symptoms and the causes, it's important to try and understand what may be causing that CBT, and nip it in the bud rather than letting it compound and escalate out of control. So yeah, that's the first one, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Medication then. So there is no routinely prescribed medication for PTSD. However, you may be offered medication if you have depression or any associated problems such as sleepiness. If you're offered medication, then this is usually an antidepressant. While PTSD is not the same as depression, the type of medication used for depression has been found to help as well. But we've got a caveat. With any discussion that we do have on medication, it's important, so important to talk about your GP or medical or health professional about taking any form of medication, for any form of anxiety or depression, as they'll be able to advise best on the options that are available to you. So yeah, medication is also a treatment option for PTSD if it should be needed.
There's also group therapy. So some people find it helpful to actually speak about their experiences with other people who've also had PTSD. Group therapy can help you find ways to manage your symptoms and understand the condition by expressing yourself and also learning that others understand how you feel. And it's quite interesting what we talked about earlier in terms of maybe feeling detached because from the stigma side of it, you can see how some people might relate and feel that group therapy would help them in a situation like that. Because if you're feeling very isolated anyway,
Definitely.
having people who understand how you feel is really important. So there are charities that provide counselling and support groups for PTSD. So one that we know of, which is Combat Stress. This is actually for ex-servicemen and women in the military. There's also Rape Crisis. This is for women and girls who have experienced abuse. And there's also another one called Cruise, and this is for those who've experienced bereavement.
Just on that note, Matt, I think it's important to know that there are them groups out there as well, because like you just said about the whole stigma, and I suppose when you're suffering from, I'm trying to put myself in the sufferer's shoes with PTSD, if you have that kind of feeling of isolation and distance and disillusionment with society, knowing that there are a group of people out there who are going through something similar to you for a very, probably quite a niche experience, I think could probably be quite comforting to a sufferer, to know that they're not alone. So yeah, it's definitely important to know that there are some charities out there that provide this counselling and support for PTSD. And finally, number 5, we have self-help therapies and techniques as well. So for some people who may want to help themselves in order to stop potentially feeling so overwhelmed by the stress that they're experiencing, they can use self-help therapies and techniques as well. So for example, maybe coping with flashbacks, you can focus on controlling your breathing or counting to 5 to calm yourself and offset the panic. Some people may also find it helpful to hold a particular object that reminds them that they are present. In the present, of course, like we've seen with PTSD, there's lots of flashbacks, nightmares, etc. So it's important to be grounded and be mindful and be in the present moment. And examples of such objects could be like key ring or jewelry. There are also other grounding techniques as well, such as describing your surroundings or even counting objects around you of a particular color to help you to connect to the present moment. And maybe even keeping a diary or a journal as well. It might be a good way to do so too. Making notes of what happens when you have a flashback could help you spot patterns and what triggers these flashbacks, and could also help you to spot the early signs that they are beginning to happen. So it's not one size fits all. It's trying to find that self-help therapy and technique that works for you. It might be something really niche, really out there, but experimenting and seeing if that has an effect on your symptoms and mitigates them is really important. So yeah, self-help therapies and techniques. I'm sure there's a lot more kind of literature and advice out there as well, but it's definitely something that a sufferer of PTSD can look into.
It's also important to note that there is an article on our website about post-traumatic stress disorder, with links out to reputable sources as well, where you can go and find out more about PTSD, look at the treatments. You can look at a little bit more detail about some of the symptoms, and like I say, you can also importantly get the help that you need if you feel that you need it as well. So that's just out there for you to take advantage of.
Yeah, definitely. We've got a get help page, and yeah, take a look at the MindKeepers website as well at www.mindkeepers.org.uk. The link will be in our description. So Matt, that's the treatments as well. Quite a lot covered in today's podcast. We've covered what post-traumatic stress disorder is. We know the acronym PTSD. We've discussed what some of the causes for post-traumatic stress disorder are and how varied this can be as well, and dependent on the individual. We also know some of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and as we touched upon, they are quite varied as well, and particularly severe, and may manifest not just immediately, but some time after the event. We've also spoken about when some of these symptoms might occur, and we've also spoken about what the treatments are for PTSD as well. So quite a lot of ground covered, and I know we've had other podcasts which are probably a little bit more lighthearted, but I think it's important to stress the seriousness of post-traumatic stress disorder for the sufferer, but also spotting it in a loved one or a friend or family as well, and how severe it can be in terms of the symptoms and also the trauma that they've experienced as well. So yeah, a very important one to know about. A very important one to know about.
And that's the other thing to say as well is that we're not professionals in this sort of area. You know, this is something that me and Jack are learning about as we talk about it as well. I'm trained in mental health first aid, and I've covered post-traumatic stress disorder as part of that course, but I'm not a professional in it. And I think it's important to get that out there, that me and you are learning about this stuff as well, and that we're sharing it with people, because actually it's what it's all about. It's about learning about what these conditions are, and if you don't properly understand them, then the first step to understanding someone with that condition, or whether you have it, is to educate yourself, and just hopefully someone will learn a little bit, like we've learned a little bit today, about post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, definitely. So we hope you found it useful. And of course, there are plenty more episodes to come on the Anxiety Explained series. As we say, that's episode 6. Matt, next time we check in, I hope your number is above a 6. We need to try and cheer that up. Hopefully, we've had some.
We do. We need to
better weather.
There.
We do.
Maybe a bit of mindfulness is in order.
It
maybe
is.
A little bit
it
of relaxation.
A good gym workout, potentially a good run to
I
beat
am
away
going
the
to the gym
stress.
tomorrow morning, actually. It's good shout.
Good lad. Sounds good. Well, thank you very much for listening, Matt. Thank you as always for the podcast, and yeah, we look forward to talking about our next topic in the next one. So see you then.
Thank you for listening to the MindKeepers podcast.
Our purpose is to ensure that anyone who needs help takes the steps to get it.
Break the stigma, take the step.